Welcome to this broadcast of Reflections on World Religions. We are studying not the theology, but the ethics taught by different world traditions. We're pleased today to have Rabbi Adam Spilker. He will be discussing ethics in Judaism, and we welcome Rabbi Spilker to our broadcast. Would you take a minute and introduce yourself, your educational background, and sort of your faith journey in a very short description, please?
Well, it's wonderful to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. My name is Adam Spilker. I'm a rabbi here at Mount Zion Temple in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I've been here for 26 years. And I, before that, educationally went to Duke University for my undergrad, and then after a year, straight to Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, first year in Jerusalem, 4 years then in New York City for Masters of Hebrew Letters and for my ordination. And then I came here to St. Paul.
And can you share something about your personal journey that brought you to not only Judaism, which may have been an inherited religion, but more specifically to your calling as a rabbi?
There was a moment where I was in college and thinking about being a radiation oncologist and was at an internship, and all of a sudden realized I would rather be on the other side of the bed, holding the person's hand and offering counsel. And so that was a time of transition for me to start thinking about being a rabbi. But I actually started attending synagogue only at age 14. Both my parents are Jewish, but it was a personal choice that brought me to want to learn about who I was in relationship to people over time and space. And it was an extraordinary thing to first attend a synagogue and realize I was part of a 3,000-year-old tradition and connections to people around the world. And so that's been part of the spiritual connection for me. And if I could share just one other part, during college, we had a summer in Israel where half of us were Christian, half Jewish, and we were at an archaeological dig, and it was somewhere in the Iron Age in the earth where all of a sudden I felt this incredible connection to my past and to the humanity's past, and I knew I wanted to be a part of that, and eventually knew that I wanted to do it authentically, fully from within my own tradition.
Well, I commend you for that dedication, and I have the utmost respect for the Christian heritage in Judaism. I think most Christians do not realize that, certainly for the first century of Christianity, it was a sect of Judaism. And for those of us who have studied, we realize that the fundamental theology, the fundamental concepts of God come out of our Hebrew heritage and Jewish heritage. And I agree when Protestants, particularly, and less educated clergy, don't understand the roots of Christianity and Islam. Incidentally, and this is not really part of the planned speech, do you do much with interfaith dialogue, particularly among Abrahamic faiths?
I do, and I always have. It's been, in many ways, an entry point for me into my own understanding of myself. Good friend of mine who's now a Presbyterian minister, and I taught a class on Jewish-Christian relations back in college, and ever since have been engaged. And right now, part of a group called the Minnesota Multi-Faith Network. So it's Abrahamic faiths, but much beyond as well, which is actually the landscape we are living in America, which is beyond the Abrahamic faiths.
Well, good for you. I'm very active in pluralistic studies and outreach, and have been for a number of years, but I certainly appreciate you and your tradition. Let me share with us, if you will, the overview of Judaism in the world today.
It's obviously a big question. I'm going to start with a quote, actually, from Sarah Hurwitz, who is a speechwriter, phenomenal teacher, recently of a new book. And she has this more contemporary definition, which she says Judaism equals 4,000 years of crowdsourced wisdom from millions of people about what it means to be human, how to be a good person, how to lead a worthy and meaningful life, how to leave a legacy for the next generation, how to build strong families and communities, and how to find a profound spiritual connection. And I just love that as an overview. So it's ancient, which means that our earliest confrontations with God, our conversations with God, which are sourced in the Tanakh and our Torah, Those are from our ancestors who were ancient Israelites living in a completely different context. And yet somehow we draw a line from their wisdom through the present day. But it isn't just in that book. It isn't, you can't just read the Bible to understand Judaism. Judaism equals 2,000 years of engagement on these questions. And one of the theological claims that we make is that each one of us says that we ourselves left Egypt. So we have that primary sense that we were an oppressed people, experienced that, and therefore will never oppress anyone else, and became a people. So it's a very much of a communal thing. It's not an individual who found enlightenment in our tradition who then sourced it for all of us. It was a collective experience. We all then therefore stood at Mount Sinai. And when I teach confirmation every year to our 10th graders, they are the ones on the we call it a bima, the raised platform of the synagogue, representing our people at Sinai. And that moment is a collapsing of time, as if we are standing right there at Sinai, and everything we say and teach is connected to that we thou kind of experience.
That is wonderful. And I love that quote. I'd love for you to send that to me. In the Reformed tradition of which I was schooled, we hinge our faith on the call of Abraham, Genesis 12:3, called to be blessed and to be a blessing. And I see that as a fundamental stepping point for God and God's people. Is that as paramount in your theology as it is in the Reformed theology?
It is, absolutely. That is the central call, that to respond to God without the answers being laid out so clearly. I mean, Abraham is called, Lech Lecha, go forth, and he gets to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Canaan, and God is not responding to him at that point. And then there's a famine, and Abraham has to figure out, Avram at that point, what to do, and he chooses to get food in Egypt, which is another point of why it's a call to us, is that life is not always so clear. And if even Abraham had that sense of confusion with that clarion call to start this new tradition, to bring God into this world, how much the more so we.
Well, that is a fundamental part of the theology I was schooled in 40 years ago, called to be blessed and through whom to be a blessing to others, as Abraham and followers of the God of Abraham. Could you clarify for us the difference between the Talmud, the Pentateuch, as we call it, and the general Hebrew scriptures?
Sure. Well, the Pentateuch, the Greek for five, meaning the 5 books of Moses, we call the Torah. We call the larger book of what we call the Bible in our term Tanakh, which stands for Torah, the 5 books, Nevi'im, which are the prophets, all the prophetic works, starting from the historic moments of Judges and Joshua through the Kings and all the prophets, to the writings, the last piece. And the writings ends with Chronicles, which restates the entire story of our people. So in some level, and this is important for folks to know, it's not exactly the same as the Old Testament, because the order is different and our ways we group the books are different. That represents 800 years of our people. So it's not a short amount of time, lots of ways of thinking, lots of historic moments. And once that was codified, the writing did not end, and the continuation of writing is then amalgamated into the next 800 years of writing called the Talmud. And that wisdom is both within the land of Israel, there's a Jerusalem Talmud, and then in Babylon, the Babylonian Talmud. And I won't go through all the other iterations after that, but those 2 sources, the Talmud, which is rabbinic Judaism, and one way to understand this is translating, is a sister faith to Christianity, both with the basis of the Bible, translating an agrarian society's traditions and ethics into an urban setting where we were starting to live. And Talmud is, it means learning, and it is questionable to what degree its authority is. And so this is where you start getting different streams of Judaism's interpretations. You go back even more historically, you get the Samaritans who didn't subscribe to it, or the Karaites. I mean, so they're always, just as in any tradition, different groups who hold on to different parts of it. But that represents Rabbinic Judaism, and its authority is kind of funny because the Talmud itself offers little guidance on specific actions you're supposed to do. That's a little bit too strong a statement, meaning there are plenty of arguments in the Talmud that end with Elijah's going to come and decide for us. So it is not something that says this is what you're supposed to do. That thought of thinking, what do I do, that crosses into what we're talking about today about ethics, are codes of laws that tell us what to do. That came after the Talmud.
Another question that comes up is the correlation between these writings and what is most authoritative. You're outlining different, the Talmud, the other Hebrew writings. What is most authoritative for Jews today in their ethical interpretations of life?
The Torah remains the most authoritative because it represents literally the same words that we have been reading for millennia. And the way I often to think about it for myself and describe it to our community is the same 304,805 letters in a Torah scroll. We're talking about the 5 books of Moses. And that number is one I've learned, because each letter is holy, has been read in the same way by our people, and I shouldn't say the same way, but read by my ancestors and people we know, and Christians and Muslims for millennia, and that makes it holy. So that the authority is in its repetition. But how we interpret it, that's through the lens of many different texts and many different lived experiences. But I still would believe that the most authoritative is Torah.
Dead Sea Scrolls, when they were found, predated the oldest Hebrew text by something like hundreds of years, 900 years, something like that. And it was shocking how little had changed in that older text from what was the more newer text. That is not the case found in Greek New Testament findings. We find something that's a century before the previous, and all of a sudden we realize how much has been edited and changed. And what was striking to me was the unchangeable nature of the Old Testament over such a long period, which highlighted the sanctity of translating that we did not see in the New Testament writings.
I hear you, and I agree. And that's part of what I teach as well. Is remarkable is how little has changed, because the role of the person writing each text was to be absolutely faithful to every letter and not change one letter. And then it was a big debate about whether to translate this into Greek for the Alexandrian Jews in the 3rd century, which became the Septuagint. So the story goes that 70 scholars went into their own rooms to translate it into the Greek, and lo and behold, they all came up with the exact same translation, which just shows the challenge of translation in and of itself. But it makes sense that there will be variant translations into the Vulgate, Septuagint, and such.
The Hebrew Old Testament, as we call it, is the foundation of all the theology of the New Testament. The resurrection, people think that's new. It was from at least Isaiah on. There's very little concept in the New Testament that's not a sprinkling, if not a direct application of what was inherited from our Jewish heritage. Could you talk to us a little bit about that heritage in the context of the ethical, both personal and corporate? By corporate, I mean social and personal ethics that are prescribed by the text of the Hebrew Old Testament.
What's remarkable about the ethics that are present in the Tanakh and the Torah or Old Testament is just how profound they are and how clear they are, and how sometimes they're buried within other texts because there was no concept of separation between ethics and ritual in the ancient mind. And so ethics were just part and parcel of how one lives, and there were certain guidances. So how one prays to God is the same conversation as how one chooses to give charity. These things were connected. So the centerpiece, and actually, if you think about a scroll, you put the most central thing in the middle of the scroll because it's most protected, and that's Leviticus chapter 19. And that is where you learn what we call, and many traditions have called, the center of ethics, which is loving your neighbor as yourself. And what's fascinating, if you look at that verse in verse 18 in chapter 19, and is that it's not a verse that says, love your neighbor as yourself. It's a verse that says, you shall not take vengeance nor bear a grudge with your fellow neighbor. You should love your neighbor as yourself. So the pathway to getting to love is through removal of hate and disgruntlement and all the things that challenge us about other people. That's the first part of the loving each other as ourselves. And so that's one of the centerpieces, as we know. And I can say more about that, but I'll pause there.
And of course, that follows from the Shema, which is love the Lord thy God, right? That would be the first commandment that would always be most prevalent. But as far as personal ethics to others, it would be Leviticus 19, 18, 19. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, well, once you start talking about commandments, mitzvot, and there's 613 of them. The first one is be fruitful and multiply. If you're looking in order there. So Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 is the Shema, and then the V'ahavta, you shall love the Lord your God by doing these mitzvot, which are about people and about living in a good life. Yes, they're connected.
How do you boil down all those 613 commandments and both restrictions and prohibitions and advocacies to, obviously we have the 10 commandments, which is probably fundamental, but what beyond the 10 commandments is the fundamental template for us to live as faithful people from a Jewish perspective?
Well, partly by saying 613, and this is now I want to acknowledge, I'm a Reform rabbi within the Reform tradition, and there are different streams of Judaism. I acknowledge change in our tradition, which all streams of Judaism do, and I acknowledge the ability to update those with our modern times. 613, if you ask anybody, any Jew today, what are the 613 mitzvot? It'll be hard to find someone who will be able to name a good number of them, because there are just so many, and many of them are not applicable except if you're living in the land of Israel. Maimonides, 800 years ago, wrote a book called The 613 Mitzvot, and he started a 100-year war in Judaism because people disagreed with him about what those were, which is some way of saying to me that we are all still struggling for what God wants from us. So our tradition has done what I think you're suggesting, which is we have to get to smaller numbers. And there's a saying in our tradition that Rabbi Simlai said that mitzvot, 613 mitzvot, commandments were given to Moses, but David came and reduced them to 11 in Psalm 15, Isaiah to 6 in chapter 33, Micah to 3, which is more familiar to many of us, chapter 6, verse 8, to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. And then Isaiah said to just do 2, maintain justice, and to do what is right. And Habakkuk just said 1, the righteous person lives by his faithfulness. So we've tried in various ways to reduce them to what is at the core, because it's too great to think about all of those.
Am I incorrect to think that the Mosaic Law specifically?
I would say that in general, there is no literal readers of our tradition. I mean, whether Orthodox or Reform, no one reads the Bible literally. Especially Orthodox will only read it through the lens of the Talmud and interpretation. So that's one way of saying it. Another way of saying it is the Torah. Another way of talking about what it is, it's a constitution of the Jewish people at that time. It's not about a faith, it's about a people and all the ways that they lived. And you can compare it to the Hittite laws of the time and the other ancient Near Eastern laws, because it was innovations in how people live together on a day-to-day basis. So there's a fancy term, casuistic law. When something this happens, this is what you're supposed to do. Well, some of those things do not apply. The laws about slavery were in the social context of its day, not about today. We have a different way of setting up our society, thank goodness. But there are some laws, like the 10 Commandments, which are really just 10 sayings. We call that apodictic law, which is thou shalt not. meaning these are more that transcend all the ins and outs of society, and those have stayed the test of time. And there are others that pop up in Deuteronomy. You shall not remain indifferent. To me, that's one of the most profound calls to action, which Rashi, an 11th century commentator who influenced a lot of Christian thought around that time as well, he says on that verse, chapter 23 of Deuteronomy, you shall not remain indifferent, which means you shall not pretend to close your eyes and not see.
Let me jump to the barriers for being a good person. Now, in the Christian tradition, we talk about original sin, and it's just the concept that the fabric of humanity is not perfected in its very nature. And that's not to say that God didn't create it initially in some perfected way, but that at least as we are born, we're born selfish and self-centered. And there's a call to try to perfect ourselves, which in our mind, we never truly achieve this side of the grave. Can you talk to me a little bit about the Jewish theology of the fallen nature and the concept of perfection?
Yes, my pause is just the perfection piece. I was also made my mind go in a different direction with where I was going to start, but I'm going to just start by saying in Judaism, there is not the concept of original sin. My teacher jokes that if there's any original sin in Judaism, it's that we're born in with the baggage of our parents, and we have to, that's what we didn't choose that, but there we are. But we know from Genesis, and this is profound, that God knows that we are evil from our youth. So what does that mean? Or that God created us in Genesis, and we notice in the Hebrew letters that there's an extra letter, which teaches us that there are two, it's in the word for with heart, which actually means mind in the biblical understanding, an extra letter, which allows the rabbinic tradition to offer this. And this is, if you're asking what Judaism says, I would say this is primarily what Judaism says, but it's rabbinic Judaism, that we are given two hearts, which is the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Hatov, the good inclination and the evil, and the good inclination and the evil inclination. And those both sit within us. Some might say, actually, we're born only with the evil inclination, and it takes time for society to teach us the good inclination if we're fortunate to subdue and I would actually say channel the evil inclination. But here I need to say, in Judaism, the evil inclination might be better translated as instinct, animalistic urges, our general human nature, ambition. It's not necessarily bad. It just needs to be channeled in the right way. Because our Talmud says, without the evil inclination, and this gives some indication, no one will get married, no one will get a job, and no one will build a house. So you need it, but you need to channel it in the right way. So that's the primary view of humanity, I would argue, that Judaism has, that there's something fundamentally workable with us. But if we leave nature to its own courses, we will be just like the animals. And let me just, I guess I will just add, I'm sorry, apologize. I mean, that the idea of perfection is not as strong. We, even, or to remove oneself from society, to perfect oneself, there's potential for that. There's a Nazir vow that one can make anciently. But basically, we're supposed to be part of society. And there are a few people who have attained such a level of living a good life, of subduing and channeling that evil inclination, that we call them righteous people, tzaddik, but very far and few between.
There's a exchange in Matthew where someone says to Jesus, the rabbi, good teacher. And his response is, no one is good but God alone. My exegetical work with that is that he's calling you to the path towards perfection that will always be elusive this side of the grave, that it's a call towards the light of perfection, not that we can ever attain that.
100%. Yeah, that is the same. And I'll just add that when Abraham is told to be perfect, the Hebrew word is tamim, you shall be holy. The emphasis should be on shall be. Only God is holy. Shall be it's a lifetime process of working towards holiness, of seeing oneself as worthy of being the better person. So it is a process, not something that we assume we achieve.
As a clergy person, do you feel that you're held to higher standards, moral standards, than other people? Is because of your training, or is it expected of you to be more morally perfected than the people who are around you?
Only from the sense of natural human desire, not from any kind of theological purpose, meaning we all want the heads of our groups and the heads of our, especially our religious institutions, to be worthy and to be models. And so therefore there is sometimes that sense that we are held to a higher standard. But that's just from a natural point of view. There's nothing, as I said, that we ought to be from any kind of point of view. We are not doing anything on behalf of anyone else. So I try to emphasize my humanity and the fact that I'm human like everyone else, as everyone knows. And in our day and age with clergy abuses and scandals, no one doubts that clergy are human. So we all are doing the best we can. I will share that I wear this kippah, which is not a requirement. It's just something that says that in the sense of our humility before God. But I do know that if I wear this in public, I know that I'm representing myself as a Jew. And therefore, I use it as a tool to help myself be a better person, because I try to exemplify the best of being a good person, because people are seeing me as a Jewish person.
That's admirable. It's remarkable to me in my study of history how one group of people, relatively small group of people in the population of the world, there are 16 million Jews or so in the world by my counting. It may be different than that, but very small considering the nearly 8 billion people on earth. But one small group of people has maintained an identity for so long, but also received such enormous persecution. How does the Jewish psyche wrap their head around that?
This is such a good and hard question. I will say that it is one we strive to answer. In our religious school, we have 3 goals for our students. One is knowledge, the second is community, and the third is positive Jewish identity, meaning that there's enough identity that is given to them that is negative. And thankfully, in the scheme of human events, we are dealing in a very good age, even with the challenges we are facing in terms of living together as humanity and not hating each other. I think we are doing really well. But I am challenged continually about the numbers, both positively and negatively. Negatively, we were 17 million before the Holocaust, and we're only 16 million now. That hits me with such profound sense of responsibility for representing. And as you said, it is an incredibly small percentage of the world, and people give us outsized numbers based on what they think the Jewish population is. But it is so important for us. Now I'm just trying to think about one other piece that you were asking about, which was how do we teach about this and reflect on the persecution?
Yeah.
I would say that we have to be eyes wide open about that. And on some level, it has kept Jews Jews. And that is a challenging thing. I don't want to think about that. On the other hand, the fact that we're still here is one of the things that gives me some faith in God. Like, how in the world is it possible that this small people have maintained itself throughout all these millennia? And I say this with full humility. It gives me a sense of like, there is some element of my belief in God from that fact. And I remember the Kaiser asked Bismarck, so give me proof of God's existence. And he goes, the Jews. And those kinds of stories exist because there's some sense that this seems to defy logic. There are a couple other things I would love to share.
Please.
I just do that right now and just.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I would just say that there's one, we know that a lot of our derivation of our ethics comes from the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. And Rabbi Akiva in our Talmud says that, but then somebody named Ben Azai comes up to Rabbi Akiva and says, you know what, there's something more profound that grounds our ethics, and that is Genesis 5:1. These are the generations of Adam. In the image of God, God created Adam. And the idea that each of us is in the image of God, and if one fully feels that, everything else follows. And Ben Azai wasn't even a rabbi. But he had the wherewithal to be able to speak to the greatest sage of his time to share this. And then it gets preserved in our tradition and be part of our conversation. And I think, to me, that is profound. My own teacher, Rabbi Eugene Borowitz, who wrote some of the books of ethics of the Jewish people in the 20th century, had a practice in the subway where he would look in the face of each person around him and say, in the image of God, in the image of God. And that's how he started his day, with that practice. And that practice is part of something that we are calling a 1,000-year-old tradition in our Judaism called Musar, which can be translated as ethics, but it's broader than that. And that is about how to actually do what one chooses, one desires, not just know it. It's one thing to know ethics, it's another thing to do it. And the Musar tradition within Judaism, which is being revived, and at Mount Zion, we have dozens of people studying this and practicing it, because it is a practice, learning with a soul curriculum how to work on honor and patience and other attributes, love of God, so that one can, and trust, so that one can live a worthwhile path. So it's not just knowing it, it's actually doing it. And this is one of the paths within Judaism called Musar, once again, that is allowing it to be coming into full flowering for the 21st century.
In my work with exegesis, I felt often that one of the New Testament words most often abused and least understood in the Greek is the term believe or belief, as if it is something you can just do of the head. And repeatedly in my read and study, it's really something that starts in the head, possibly, but it transforms the heart, and then it's seen in the hands and feet. It's a trusting action based on a belief, not just the belief itself, and which means putting into action the ideals that God has called you to both receive and to envision and to live out. And I hear you saying the same thing.
I am indeed. And it's a beautiful way of articulating that. My teacher, Alan Marinas, would say, faith is knowing that there's a wall right here. There's no wall right here. Trust is leaning into that wall. And if there's anything we know about biblical thinking, they were very concrete, as you just said. So when Paul quotes Abraham as having faith in God, it was more active than just faith in God. I was just part of a Aspen Institute Religion and Society conference in DC, where my takeaway was that religion and interreligious understanding, the way you're talking about it, is going to save democracy in America. And it's a pretty strong claim, but I believe if we do on this level and a lot of the other levels the work that needs to be done, it'll help people see each other and save us from the polarization that is happening.
We want to thank the Rabbi for joining us today and appreciate his wisdom and his commitment to making the world better through his religious convictions in Judaism. Let me highlight a few of the scripture texts that are fundamental to the Jewish ethic we've just reviewed. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. This means that every person has a divine spark that should be honored. God said to Abraham, I will bless you so that you will be a blessing to others. The receipt of a blessing is only as good as it is when it is shared. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And in both Old and New Testament, this love does not mean affection. It means goodwill. Our Rabbi also said from Psalm 15, those whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, those tongues utter no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbor, and casts no slur on others, who despises a vile person, but honors those who fear the Lord, who keeps an oath even when it hurts, and does not change their mind, who lends money to the poor without interest, and who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. From the prophet Isaiah, those who walk righteously and speak what is right, who reject gain from extortion and accepts no bribes, who stops their ears against plots of murder and shuts their eyes against contemplating evil. From the prophet Micah, this is a hinge between the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament, accepted by both faiths. God has shown you, O mortals, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. Thank you for joining us. Let us remember that as we understand, we become more tolerant. As we understand and become more tolerant, we help build peace within ourselves and within our world community.